Holy Water at the Hilton, an origin story. Lowell Classic, The Hilton, May 2010. The year was 1909. George had bought an 80-acre piece of cut-over woodland and had started clearing it for a farm. He intended to buy a few dairy cows, expand the herd as heifers were born, and from April through November, sell the milk to the local cheese factory. In winter, the cows would be dry, the road would be unplowed, and he would be working in a lumber camp for weeks at a time. In addition to dairy cows, he would need horses to till the fields, harvest the crops, pull the stone boat, skid logs out of the woods, and spread manure. Like all farmers of his time, he would also raise other livestock for eating at home and minor cash sales. George planned to get started by building a log stable for cows and horses and add a few pigs when he got a suitable place for them built. He couldn't get any chickens or plant a garden until he found a wife, because gardening and tending the hens was women's work. He figured he better not build a house until he was engaged, so that his future wife would feel it was built for her. Therefore, finding a wife became a high priority in fulfilling his life ambition of becoming a self-sufficient farmer. He only had one special thing to offer to a prospective wife. His farm had a spring high enough on the hillside that a house could be built below it. One day, George took his sweetheart Martha over to the bubbling water and proposed to her by promising her that if she married him, he would pipe that water down to a house that they would build on the slope below. Martha thought for a moment about cold, continuous running water in her kitchen. Running water in the house was a rare amenity for a farm housewife in 1909. Most farm women had to pump water from a dug well or carry it up from a stream. Every day of her life would be a lot easier with running water from their spring. So Martha responded to the proposal in the affirmative. "Yes, I will marry you, George Poppy. I do so love cold, continuous running water." Martha's spring continued to flow through the droughts of the 1930s and provided water for Martha's kitchen, the Poppy's livestock, and neighbors whose wells had dried up. While the spring could have watered more cattle and more horses and cooled more milk, the shallow soils could not produce more crops. Without more hay and grain for his milking cows, George never could afford a tractor or large farm implements. Even if he had, the small fields, abundant stones, and exposed bedrock made modern equipment impractical. The only motor that ever called the Poppy homestead home was a Model T Ford. George was so proud of his Model T that he nailed every expired license plate to the wall next to the house's main entrance. For years, the Poppys could not even afford to send their girls to school in the winter. Mile Road was not plowed, and for several months the snow was too deep to walk through. Skis were necessary to get to the grade school about 4 miles away in Highbridge. The girls begged their dad for skis so they could go to school during the long northern winters. George knew that he couldn't produce more crops from his little fields, and his cows couldn't produce more milk without that feed. Still, the soil was pretty good for potatoes, and the location favored growing apples. The long slope of the farm allowed cold air to drift away, thus reducing the chance of freezing the tender apple blossoms. Instead of simply telling them that the family couldn't afford skis, George and Martha had a proposal for their girls. It was a proposal that Steinbeck could have used if he had written a novel about the cutover, using the same themes he used in The Grapes of Wrath. A little background. The cutover refers to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and roughly the northern halves of Minnesota and Wisconsin. After these lands were logged, the timber companies, encouraged by state governments and land-grant universities, sold the land to immigrant farmers under the banner, "The plow shall follow the axe." The immigrant farmers in the cutover were mostly from Eastern and Northern Europe, where they had little chance of owning their own farm. However, the stars in their eyes from thinking about owning their own land were quickly replaced. First, The stars were replaced with sweat, dripping from their brows as they cleared the huge stumps and harvested thousands of stones with stone boats each spring. Then, in succession, the stars in their eyes were replaced with tears when forest fires from the timber slash burnt their buildings, again when the price of farm products fell after the World War I demand dried up, then when the price of farm products fell further during the Great Depression, again when the drought of the 1930s withered their hayfields to the point that they had to chop down trees so the cows could eat the leaves, routinely when the frosts came late in May and early in September, diminishing their fruit and vegetable crops, continuously when farmers to the south who had settled earlier on better soil with better climate could afford modern equipment to efficiently produce an abundance of farm products that ensured farm prices would remain low. Next, when their neighbors could no longer pay the property taxes and moved south to work in factories in urban centers like Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Detroit, or west to California to compete with the Okies as migrant farm workers. The tears continued when those property taxes went up because the tax base went down as more farmland went off the tax rolls, as rural grade schools within walking distance became more and more difficult to keep open with declining enrollment, as neighbor after neighbor moved away after losing their farm to the bank for delinquency on mortgage payments or to the county for delinquency on property taxes. Eventually, a large fraction of the farms became tax delinquent and ended up as county, state, and federal forests. Across the cutover, a new reality emerged. Land cleared with an immense investment of human effort started naturally reverting to trees within 1 or 2 generations. The slogan could now have declared, "The volunteer seedlings shall follow the plow." George and Martha managed to always pay their property taxes, but there was no money left for the skis. Undaunted, George proposed that the girls plant and tend an extra-large potato garden, pray against a late May frost when the apple trees were blooming, dig the potatoes, pick the apples, and help him sell the potatoes door to door from their Model T in Ironwood, Michigan. The next fall, his girls collected bumper crops of both potatoes and apples. Ironwood residents could not resist the charm of the motivated and adorable vendors in their matching homemade smocks. They earned enough money to buy skis, but only a single pair, which they shared by each going to school on alternating days that winter. The next summer, they planted potatoes again, their prayers against a late frost were answered again, and the people of Ironwood were still hungry. They had money to buy a second set of skis, and they both went to school every day. I tell the story of Martha's spring and the story of Ethel's and Agnes's determination to go to school in winter over and over again to guests at the Hilton. I don't have the skis to show, but I can take them up to the spring and point out the plumbing in the house that still brings cold, continuous water into the kitchen and bathroom. The trees that were the focus of the girls' prayers in May still stand in neat rows near the house. After George died, those same apple trees fed the renters' cows who spread and fertilized the apple seeds that now share their bounties as fruitful volunteer trees. They have spread across the dozens of acres of land that George spent years making somewhat tillable, tree by tree, stump by stump, and rock by rock. George's fields have given way to the volunteer seedlings now. The only evidence that the paddocks ever existed lies in scattered outcroppings of unearthed rocks and stretches of rusty barbed wire protruding from the centers of mature tree trunks. Yet, the Hilton still stands, largely unchanged. The last addition to the wall of license plates reads 1959 because George died in 1960. Now, some of our own mementos form a mosaic on the opposite wall. Each summer, as we repair the cracking plaster upstairs, sometimes drawings of 2 little girls appear on previously repaired layers. Our 2 boys have since contributed their own sketches of our northern refuge. I hope George, Martha, Ethel, and Agnes would approve of our care for their sacred home. For whatever change the descending breezes may bring as they blow down slope from the spring, past the house and past the apple trees to the stream below, there is one thing that I do know for certain. The Unhilton is still the time and place to talk to myself or to God.